Hello everyone. Welcome to another story. What if Deku's quirkless friend wasn't as lucky and as delusional? If you enjoy the story, please like, subscribe and share the video. It really helps me out. I did not write the story. The original writer is Blastu2500. Please go support them. Now let us dive in. It was a sunny day in Muzutafu City. Many people living in the city spent time outside their home, making sure to enjoy the good weather as best as they could by either spending time with their friends or family or just going on a long lone walks through the city. Unfortunately, not every resident of this city could enjoy the good weather. A dark green-haired boy with a messy hair and freckles on his face and a Japanese-American boy with a short black hair were one of those people. The two boys were frightened as a group of other boys around their age ganged up on them in the middle of the playground. A green-haired boy was standing in front of the dark-haired boy, his clenched hands raised in the air as his legs shook out of fear. The dark-haired boy behind him had his face pressed against his knees as he sobbed into them, waiting for the group of bullies to leave him alone. "Why are you being so mean? You're making him cry, Kaken." The green-haired boy whimpered out to his friend-turned-bully Akatsuki Bakugo, tears forming in his eyes as he raised his fists in a defensive manner. "If you will keep on hurting him, I'll stop you myself. You want to pretend to be a hero again." Bakugo smiled viciously at him as he smashed his hands together, igniting a small explosion in his right hand, the two boys behind him activating their own quirks, showing them off to the two boys in front of them. "You don't stand a chance without a quirk, Deku." The said Deku flinched in fear when the three bullies moved towards him and the other boy, but didn't move out of the way and remained where he stood, even though he was completely terrified. It wasn't long before Deku ended on the ground, bruised. His eyes stared blankly at the sky. The bullies left the playground a while ago, leaving him with the crying boy. His eyes wandered to the side when the boy from earlier appeared on his right. The unknown boy, who had tears marks going down from his emerald green eyes to his cheeks, held his hand out to him, shaking as if he feared Deku doing something to him for taking the beating for him. Thank you for standing up for me. I'm sorry for not doing anything to help you. If I had quirk, then maybe I wouldn't be so powerless against everyone." Deku grabbed his hand and allowed the other boy to bring him back on his feet. "It's all right. Don't blame yourself for not having a quirk. I will show to everyone that quirks aren't everything, because I want to become a hero." The unknown boy looked at him with a surprised look on his face. "A hero? I thought you were quirkless." "I am quirkless." Deku confirmed to be quirkless to the other boy, "But I still want to become a hero. It is my dream. I want to be the kind of a hero who saves people with a smile on his face. Like All Might. He always has a smile on his face, no matter how bad the situation is." The unknown boy stayed silent, still looking surprised by the boy in front of him wishing to be a hero, despite being quirkless. The people around him must have been led to believe that it was impossible to become one without a quirk. "I'm sorry. I don't think I've told you my name. My name is Midoriya Izuku." Deku introduced himself to him as Izuku Midoriya as he held his hand out to him. "What's your name?" The boy shifted his gaze between Izuku's eyes and hand, seeming to be a little confused by his kindness. He slowly reached out and grabbed Izuku's hand into his, before giving it a shake, a slight smile forming on his face as he did so. "I'm Takemura Gareth. All men are not created equal." Gareth Takemura learned it the hard way when he was a few-year-old child. It all started centuries ago in the country of China when a shining baby was born, and from there more people were recorded showing special abilities which as the time passed became known as quirks. As the years passed, the population of people possessing a quirk of their own had increased to the point where over 80% of the global population possessed one, and that percentage only continued to increase. Not everything about the quirks becoming commonly known in the global population was sunshine and rainbows, though. The dawn of quirks caused some people to start using them for their own not-so-good intentions, making ordinary people powerless to do anything about them. As the chaos ensued, ordinary civilians started to take matters into their own hands, and it eventually resulted in profession of a pro-hero starting to exist, making every comic book lover's dream of becoming a hero a reality. The people grew to adore the heroes, and as the time passed more people started to have dreams of becoming one. Gareth was among those people when he was younger, as he adored heroes and got excited whenever he saw one fight a villain on the TV. A wish of becoming one in his adult life even started to form in him, but he was forced to abandon those thoughts when he was diagnosed to be quirkless at the age of 4 years old. He was stunned when his doctor informed him and his parents about this, but afterwards tried to not think much about it. He thought it wouldn't change much in his life, considering how many people have been able to live a normal life without possessing a quirk of their own. Unfortunately, the reality turned out to be completely different, as in the eyes of many people, being quirkless often equaled to being a cripple. In kindergarten, his peers started to talk about him and him being quirkless behind his back, talking about him as if he was some sort of weirdo among them, calling him all sort of names. Not only that. It was when he started to have problems with bullies, as the bullies saw him as an easy target, because of him being unable to defend himself against their quirks. His younger self thought everything would stop once he would get older, but the bullying and the name-calling, everything just went worse from there. So, as third-year students, the teacher began in an almost bored tone, "It's time to start thinking seriously about your futures and what you want to do with your lives. I could pass out some career aptitude tests, but why bother?" This got almost everyone in the classroom excited, each one of the students starting up their own quirks as their teacher threw the paper into the air without care. "I know you all want to go to the hero track." His students began cheering, displaying their quirks. Yes, you all have some very impressive quirks, but no power usage allowed in school. Get a hold of yourself. Hey, teach. Everyone stopped their cheering and turned to the source of the voice, seeing Katsuki Bakugo. The blonde-haired boy laid back in his chair as he had his feet kicked up on the table. Cockiness was evident in his voice as he spoke again. "Don't lump me in with this bunch of losers. I'm the real deal, but these guys'll be lucky to end as sidekicks to some busted D-lister, huh?" His classmates were understandably outraged by him referring to them in such a manner and began shouting all kinds of stuff at him in order to voice how displeased they were by it. "Ha! You've got impressive tests results. Maybe you will get into a high." The teacher's voice instantly made his students stop shouting at Bakugo as they all froze upon mentioning a high. "He's gonna try for the national school?" A female student commented among the whispers of her classmates. "That place has only a 2% acceptance rate." The second student could be heard stating such a fact among their classmates. "It's impossible to get to." The third voice could be heard pointing out such a fact among their classmates. "That's exactly why it's the only place worthy of me." Bakugo jumped onto his desk, raising his gripped fist into the air. "I aced all the mock tests. I'm the only one at this school who stands a chance at getting in. I'll end up more popular than All Might himself and be the richest hero of all time. People all across the world will know who I am, and it all starts with a high. Oh, yeah, Midoriya, don't you want to go to a too?" The teacher mentioned another student who wanted to get into a as soon as Bakugo finished showing off his ego to everyone in the classroom. Guh. A small squeak rang through the classroom as Izuku, who had his head down on his desk for the entire time in an attempt to keep himself out of everyone's sight, slowly lifted his head up to see everyone staring at him. The classroom was engulfed in a total silence for a brief moment before everyone bursted into laughter. "Ha ha 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 ha. Midoriya!" A classmate of Izuku's shouted, laughing at the thought of him getting into a of all schools. "You're kidding, right? There's no way you're getting into the hero course without a quirk." Another classmate of Izuku yelled among the laughter. The students continued to laugh at Izuku, making all kinds of mean comments about him wanting to get into a, despise being quirkless. There were two people in the classroom who were laughing at Izuku's expense. One of them was a boy sitting in the back of the classroom. This boy was Gareth. His black hair had grew longer over the course of the last few years. It was actually reaching his shoulders now. He thought about cutting it shorter a few times, but always backed away from this idea, because he liked to have his hair long. Gareth tightly clenched his hand around his pencil, putting more pressure on it as the laughter of his classmates continued and became louder, surprising himself that his pencil wasn't broken in the half by him. "Can't you see what's happening?" Those words flew through his mind as he stared at his teacher in anticipation, hoping for him to do anything. The teacher didn't do anything, though. He just ignored it. Like he always did. "They're bullying him. Do something. Why are you ignoring it?" The other boy in the classroom who wasn't laughing at Izuku was Bakugo, but unlike Gareth, Bakugo was angry at the turn of events. He growled as he slammed his palms into Izuku's desk, making it explode. Izuku fell back onto the ground. "Listen up, Deku!" he screamed as Izuku looked up at him fearfully. "You're even worse than the rest of these damn rejects, you quirkless wanabe. You really think they would let someone like you in when they could have me?" He shifted his gaze from Izuku to Gareth and pointed at the other quirkless boy in the classroom. "At least mud over there knows his place and is not trying to into a. Gareth flinched at the nickname that Bakugo always used when he referred to him as he tightened his grip around his pencil. A quiet crack which only he heard rang through his ears as his pencil couldn't take this anymore and broke into 2 equal parts. Gareth glanced down at the remains of his pencil, sighing internally. Huh? No wait, you got it all wrong. Izuku moved his hands in weird positions, scooting backwards to the wall. He reached the wall a second later, pressing his back against it. I'm not trying to compete against you. He looked up at Bakugo. It's just that, I've wanted to be a hero since I was little. I may not have a quirk, but I can still try my hardest, can I? You'll never be able to hang with the best of the best. You'll die in the exams. Bakugo screamed back, smoke coming off his hands as his and Izuku's classmates continued to laugh at Izuku's dreams. Gareth clenched his teeth in pain upon the impact of colliding with the wall after he was rudely pushed into it by someone standing in front of him, feeling tears form in his eyes, the laughter of the 3 figures in front of him ringing through his ears. He slowly looked up at the 3 familiar figures standing in front of him. Tomohito Kazari lifted up his unzipped backpack and his 2 friends, Taiga Nakamura and Ryoyu Shintaro, watched him with smiles on his face. It wasn't the first time when the 3 of them ganged up on him in the middle of a lunch break. It was quite a common occurrence in his school life. The 3 of them would often gang up on him and do various things to him to bully him. There were many times when returned home with the news that he had gotten from them. He knew that he could report them to the principal or the teachers, but he doubted if they would do anything about it, considering that his classmates could bully Izuku during classes and the teacher was doing nothing about it. Not to mention that reporting them would most likely make everything worse and have them go after him more often than they already did. Ryoyu smirked down at him, his hands in his pockets. This is honestly starting to get boring, you know? How much it would give to show a tiny bit of resistance to us. Do you really need to ask him this question, Shintaro-kun? Taiga's voice was a mixture of amusement and confusion. The former was heard more in his tone, though. His resistance against us would be completely useless without a quirk, and I think he knows that. He simply knows his place. I know. Ryoyu responded, his smirk not leaving his face. It still is getting kind of boring with him. Sometimes I wish that he could give us a reason to remind him where his place is. Tomohito just smiled at his friend's talk as he flipped the backpack in his grasp to the other side, making everything spill out of it onto the floor, starting with his school equipment and ending with Gareth's bento box with his lunch. Gareth bit his bottom lip, doing nothing about it as he proceeded to stare down at the floor below him, waiting for this to be over. This was one of the many ways how Tomohito, Taiga and Ryoyu messed with him for their personal amusement. The 3 bullies had 2 ways of dealing with his bento box. They either spilled all of its contents into the nearest trash can, preventing anyone from eating it, and simply stole the contents of the bento box from him whenever he had something they were interested in for lunch today and ate it. This time it seemed like there was something in his bento box that interested them as Tomohito reached into his bento box after taking a good look at what it had to offer today. Gareth found out what caught Tomohito's attention a second later as Tomohito pulled out of the chocolate cake he had baked a few days ago. Tomohito put the piece of cake in his mouth and began chewing on it before holding the bento box out to his friends. Taiga and Ryoyu wasted no time and pulled out pieces of cake for themselves from Gareth's bento box. Ryoyu swallowed the piece of cake he was chewing on for the past few seconds and asked, smiling at how good the cake tasted, "What do we do with the rest?" "Do you really need to ask?" Tomohito responded, handing the bento box out to Ryoyu as he had no interest in anything else from it. "Spill it into the dumpster. It's not like anyone will have any use of it." Ryoyu nodded his head at his friend and shifted his attention to the nearest trash can. He walked over to it and made sure to spill everything from Gareth's bento box into it, leaving nothing in it for the owner of it to eat. He made his way back to his friends right after and dropped the bento box on the floor. It landed on the floor next to Gareth's backpack. Gareth remained on the floor as he lowered his gaze to the floor after seeing how the lunch he had prepared for himself this morning was just wasted, catching the 3 bullies' attention by whispering something to himself. The 3 bullies couldn't hear what he was saying, though. "What is it you're saying?" Tomohito put his free hand against his ear. "I can't hear you." Gareth looked up at the people in front of him, revealing his teary eyes. "Why do you keep doing this to me? Have you never regretted it?" "Why should we regret it?" Tomohito asked him in an amused manner, ignoring that Gareth said before this, as if he thought of him and his friends getting the consequences of their actions against a quirkless person was amusing to him. "You're nothing compared to me or to Nakamura-kun or to Shintaro-kun. Why would I or either of them pity someone like you?" It was when Tomohito put his hands on Gareth's shoulders, not giving the boy in front of him a chance to answer, and flung his knee into his torso, causing Gareth to cough out some spit as he gasped for breath. Gareth let out a gasp in a desperate attempt to get some air as he clutched his gut, falling to his knees, much to the amusement of the three boys in front of him. "Why should I pity you if you can't even defend yourself against anyone?" Tomohito stated as he smirked down at Gareth, who tried to catch a breath after receiving a knee to the gut. "I still wouldn't try anything if I were you," Taiga added. Smugness was evident in his voice as he spoke, as Shintaro-kun said, "Doing this with you over and over again with you not showing even a tiny bit of resistance might be getting a little boring at this point, but it's not like you, a useless quirkless nobody would have any chance against us." Gareth remained silent. The only response the three bullies got from him was him letting out a deep breath as he finally managed to catch a breath after Tomohito hit him in the gut with his knee. The three bullies just smirked down at him for one last time before turning away from him, beginning to walk away from him. They began talking about something but Gareth couldn't hear what they were saying. They were probably talking about Tomohito's plans for high school, as Tomohito had plans to go to Shiketsu High School. Gareth knew about this as he overheard them talking about this one day. Gareth looked up and watched them leave until they passed the corner, vanishing from his view. He wiped his eyes with the intention of getting rid of the tears, not wanting to walk through the school with them in his eyes, and reached out for his backpack. He slowly picked up all of things from the floor and packed them back into his backpack. The last thing he packed back into his backpack was his now empty bento box. It seemed like he was going to return home with an empty stomach, again. The only way of getting his lunch back and eating it would be pulling it out from the trash can, and nothing was going to force him to do it, no matter how hungry he will be for the rest of the school day. He slouched his backpack over his back and pushed himself into a walk. He began making his way through the hallway of his school, passing by many of his fellow schoolmates. He saw a few of his schoolmates casting glances his way, but pretended to not see them. It's not like they would do anything to help him whenever he was bullied by someone. They always ignored it and pretended to not see it, even when if it was happening before their eyes. He just wanted to get the place to which he was on his way before Tomohito, Ryoyu, and Taiga ganged up on him. He reached his destination a few moments later. It was the spot he and Izuku usually had their lunches at. It didn't took him long to notice his friend. Izuku was sitting on his side of the bench, eating his lunch. An open notebook was on his friend's knee. "Hey, Midoriya-kun." He greeted his friend as he walked over to him and sat down next to him, hoping that Izuku won't notice the new bruises on his body. "I'm sorry for coming a bit late." "There you are, Gakken. I was starting to think you wouldn't." Izuku's smile faded from his lips and was replaced with a look of concern upon seeing the state his friend was in, immediately noticing the bruises that weren't there before the lunch break. "What happened, Gakken?" Gareth stayed silent as Izuku quickly realized who was responsible for his friend coming to him in such a state. Was it Kazari-kun and his group again? "It's nothing, Midoriya-kun." Gareth tried to brush it off as nothing, giving his friend a fake smile. "I just had a little accident when I was on my way here, but nothing severe happened to me. You'll see, I'll be as good as new tomorrow." "You shouldn't brush this off as nothing, Gakken." Izuku knew that his friend was lying to him, his concerned expression not leaving his face. "It isn't the first time when Kazari-kun and his group bullied you. You should report them to a teacher or the principal. Maybe this make them stop bothering you." "I don't want to have more trouble, Midoriya-kun." Gareth answered to his friend's suggestion. "What is the school going to do about them? They will either give them a lecture about bullying or give them a detention. I doubt either of those things is going to make them stop, and I'm sure that everything will just get worse after they will find out that I reported them." Izuku shook his head sadly at his friend. He tried to convince Gareth to report Tomohito, Ryoyu, and Taiga to the principal a few times, but his friend always backed away from his suggestion, telling him that it would do more harm than good. It was when his attention was brought to Gareth's stomach as he heard it grumble, "You should eat your lunch, Gakken. The lunch break will end in a few minutes." Gareth put his hand on his stomach right after hearing it grumble. "I wish I could, but I don't have anything again." "They spilled it into the trash can again?" Izuku wanted to be sure. Silence which he received from his friend was the only answer he needed to get from him. He looked at his friend sympathetically as he put his hand on his bento box and pushed it towards Gareth, offering the rest of his lunch to him. "Here. You can have the rest of my lunch." Gareth shook his head at his friend's generous offer, waving his hand at him. "Midoriya-kun, you don't have to." "It's no problem, Gakken." Izuku offered his friend an assuring smile to show him that it was no big deal. "I'm sure you would do the same. I forgot my lunch or had something happen to it." Not to mention you always share the baked goods you make with me. Gareth paused when the matter of his baked goods was brought up by Izuku. If there was one thing he was good at, then it was baking, or at least he liked to think he was good at it. He took interest in it about 2 years ago. After the first cake he had baked didn't came out so wrong, he started looking for various ways to improve his skills in this area. He looked up recipes online, watched baking videos on the internet, even asked the owner of his favorite bakery for a tip or two. "You don't owe me anything, Midori-kun," he replied as he put a bit of rice in his mouth, before glancing to the side. "It's always nice to see someone enjoy the stuff I prepare. Good to know that I'm not wasting my time while preparing those." "You're not wasting your time baking, Gakken. You shouldn't think you're wasting your time by doing hobbies for as long you have fun and are not hurting anyone," Izuku said after hearing his friend doubting his baking skills again. "Have you ever thought about becoming a baker? I'm sure many people would have loved your baked goods if you became one." Gareth remained silent for a brief moment, swallowing the rice he had in his mouth. If he was honest with himself, he thought about becoming a baker in his adult life crossed his mind a few times. He never really shared those thoughts with anyone outside Izuku. Nowadays most people his age wanted to be a hero and he doubted his parents would approve of him wanting to become a baker in his adult life. "What are you doing with your notebook?" He spoke a few seconds after setting his eyes on Izuku's notebook, wanting to change the subject of the conversation. "Did you wrote something about Mountain Lady's debut this morning? I saw you writing something down about her in your notebook when we were on our way to school." "Of course I did." Izuku nodded in confirmation as he grabbed his notebook and showed the most recent entry in it to his friend. "Mountain Lady's quirk really is." Gareth felt a slight smile forming on his face as Izuku was going into the endless muttering he had known him for. This is something he always admired about his green-haired friend. He was never giving up on his dream of becoming a hero, no matter how many times people around him were telling him to give up on this dream. People telling Izuku about it so often caused Gareth to encourage his friend to follow his dreams, despite himself giving up on the thoughts of becoming a hero after learning that he was quirkless. The atmosphere in the Takemura household was cold. Just like it was for most of the time. Gareth's house was quite huge as his father Ryoma and his mother Sandra were successful lawyers and were able to afford a house like that because of it. Many people would be amazed by how empty a house as huge as his can feel like. His parents didn't talk and spend much time with him. When he was younger, they always had an excuse whenever he asked them to spend some time with him by either having something important to do regarding their work or something else which too important to leave for later. As he grew older he stopped asking them to do something with him, simply seeing no reason in further doing so. His parents never made an attempt to hide how much of a disappointment he was to all of their exceptions and how useless he was to them, even on the days when he was returning home with bruises and tears after another unpleasant encounter with his bullies. His parents cared about their image a lot and how other people saw them, more than they cared about him. They accepted him to help them maintain their image of success among the people from their environment of work, and according to them, Gareth was far away from doing a good job at doing so. The black-haired boy had lost the count of how many times he had to sit through a long lecture from his parents during which they reminded him how useless he was and how much of a failure of a son he was a long time ago. Right now, the Takemura family was gathered around the table in the dining room as they were in the middle of a dinner. Gareth silently ate his dinner, hoping to make through this dinner without any problems as his father and his mother sat in front of him on their seats, the two of them eating their own dinners. "Gareth." His father spoke to Gareth in a stern tone he was known to be often using around his son as Gareth bit his bottom lip as he looked up from his food at his father, bracing himself as he knew what was going to happen. "We heard that there was another incident at school which involved you and a group of boys a few days ago. It's not my fault," Gareth said in an attempt to defend himself, even though he was aware that it would be no use. He knew to what incident his father was referring to. It was one of the many times when Tomohito, Ryoyu and Taiga messed with him for their personal amusement. "It's just, I can't do anything whenever they go after me, because I don't have a quirk." "You again with this excuse? How many times do we have to tell you?" His mother cut him off. She looked at him as if she was offended by having to remind him about that. Having no quirk is not an excuse. People all around the world are born without a quirk of their own and yet they are somehow able of achieving something in their life. Is it really that hard for you to be one of those people? Gareth opened his mouth with intention of responding to his mother's words, but his words died in his throat when he remembered how talking back to her in his own defense or how telling his parents what they didn't want to hear during their lectures would end for him. The first time when he tried to do it ended up with receiving a smack to the face which always knocked him to the floor and hurt him to the point where he had to stop himself from crying. He tried to do the same a few more times, but his attempts always with getting hit either by his mother or father, depending on who was closer to him. His mother raising her hand in the air once she saw him opening his mouth to say something only seemed to confirm his suspicious of what would happen if he tried to say something to her in his own defense. This is why he decided to stay silent, not wanting to get hit by her. His mother lowered her hand, even though she was eyeing him as if she was waiting for an opportunity to her son a lesson. Look at yourself. His mother's voice was filled with disgust and disappointment as she spoke to him. Is there anything you are good at? Average grades. No successes in school. You can't defend yourself against anyone. Barely made any friends in your life. The only person you've been hanging around for your entire life is this green-haired kid. Gareth clenched his left hand, once again stopping himself from saying anything in response out of fear of getting hit by either of them. He tried to hang out with other kids other than Izuku when he was younger because Izuku always followed Bakugo around for some reason. Needless to say, he didn't enjoy hanging out with them. If it wasn't for Izuku, he would stay away from them. They always looked down and made fun of him and his green-haired friend for being quirkless, and the two of them were forced to endure it, often being left in tears because of it. There were many times when he tried to do something to impress them with hopes of them stopping to look down on him, but unfortunately the results were always the same, negative. He still couldn't believe how naive his younger self was when he thought that mastering skimming stones to nearly perfection would be enough for the others to stop looking down on him. Do you have any idea how you make us look in front of other people? His father spoke next. Disappointment in his voice was evident. Do you have any idea how embarrassing it is for us whenever one of our colleagues and someone from our family asks us about you? Every time when it happens, you're making us look like a laughingstock. Gareth kept his left hand clenched as he lowered his gaze to the floor because he saw the looks his parents were giving him, doing his best to stop the tears which were building up in his eyes from spilling down his cheeks, knowing that it would just make the situation worse for him, because he happened to burst into tears a few times during their lectures and it always made everything worse for him. Gareth closed his eyes as he thought about his parents and the way they saw for him for his entire life. Why? Why couldn't they express their concern for him at least once after he went back home in bruises and tears to show that they cared about him? Why couldn't put their desire of being seen as a people of success by the other people aside and think about him and how he felt like for a second? Why did they have to make him feel worse about himself every time when they spoke with him? How can you look at yourself in the mirror every morning and not feel useless and ashamed of yourself whenever you see yourself in it? His mother questioned, the disgust and disappointment not leaving her tone. Is it really this hard for you to start making a name for yourself? Is it really this hard for you to start doing something with your life and stop making our family look like a laughingstock? Ryoma sighed, shaking his head in disappointment. Why do you have to be such a useless failure? You can't even look at us when we're talking to you. It hurt. It hurt Gareth whenever he heard his parents refer to him in such a way. It hurt him and made his self-worth sunk lower than it already was, no matter how many times when they referred him in such a way when they were voicing how much of a disappointment he was to them. He thought that he would get used to his parents calling him those names over time, but that never happened. In fact, each time just made him feel worse about himself. Gareth attempted to say something as he looked up at his parents, but was interrupted as soon as he opened his mouth. Be quiet. Sandra coldly cut her son off. Just eat what you have in front of you. Gareth nodded his head to show his parents that he understood their lecture as he proceeded to do his best to not break into tears in front of him, aware of how it would end for him. He quietly went back to eating his dinner, even though he had lost his appetite, because of the harsh lecture he received from his parents. He simply didn't want to do anything to anger them again. He didn't want to go through another long lecture that would do nothing but remind him how useless he is. The rest of the dinner went in a painfully awkward silence. Just like most of the dinners in their house went whenever something like that happened. It took him a few minutes to finish his dinner. He stood up from his seat and picked up his now empty did his best to ignore the looks of disappointment and disapproval he had received from his parents once he passed them and made his way to the counter on the kitchen and put the place down on it. He walked out from the kitchen and quickly made his way to his room. He grabbed the door handle and opened the entrance to it. He closed the door behind him as soon as he stepped into his room and jumped onto his bed. He landed on his stomach, his face facing the pillow, allowing the tears he's been keeping contained in his eyes for the past few minutes to spill from his eyes, soaking his pillow in them. He lifted his head up from his pillow and glanced to the side at his video game console, which he had bought with his savings about a year ago, considering if he should play something on it, like he usually did to make himself feel better, but backed away from this idea. He shifted his gaze away from his video game console and put his head down on the pillow again. He closed his eyes, wanting to drift to sleep as fast as possible, simply wanting this day to be over. It took him a while to fall asleep as he happened to have trouble falling asleep tonight. The last thought that crossed his mind before going to sleep was, "Why are you so useless?" Gareth felt a little tired after opening his eyes because of the trouble he had falling asleep the night before when he awoke. He sat up on his bed and buried his face in his hands, letting out a sigh into them, the memories of the incident with his parents the day before and the feeling of how useless he was still fresh on his mind. He quickly pushed those thoughts out of his head, though, because he knew he had to get ready for school today, even though he wanted to stay home today. His parents would be more than displeased if they found out he skipped school today, and the thought of doing something to anger was scared him, because he didn't want to go through another one of their lectures. His morning routine went as usual. He readied himself for the day in the bathroom and afterwards prepared himself a breakfast and a lunch for the lunch break in the kitchen before leaving his house for school. He eventually came across Izuku on the place where they would usually meet up on their way to school, and from there walked the rest of the way to his destination with him. Nothing unusual happened at school either. The classes went as usual. Bakugo's cronies made some mean comments regarding him and Izuku during classes, but except for this one thing, nothing else happened during his classes. At least he got to enjoy his lunch today, as Tamahito and his group gave him a break today and didn't bother him again. Perhaps today he will be able to get through his day without any problems. After the final bell rung, he started getting himself ready to leave. He packed his school equipment into his backpack, with most of his classmates heading out of the classroom as he did so. He got up from his seat and slouched his backpack over his back. He made his way to the exit from the classroom and leaned against a doorway, waiting for Izuku to approach him. His green-haired friend was still on his seat, browsing through his phone. Izuku glanced away from his phone to his side and saw Gareth waiting for him by the exit from the classroom. He nodded his head at him, letting him know that he was going without saying any words to him. He put his phone away and hid it in his pocket, before grabbing his notebook. He lifted it up and was about to put it in his backpack, but was stopped from doing so by Bakugo. The blonde-haired boy ripped the notebook from Izuku's grasp and began fanning himself with it, glaring down at him. "Don't know what you think you're doing, Deku, but we're not done." "Whatcha got?" one of Bakugo's cronies asked, grinning as the two of them approached Bakugo from behind. "His diary?" Although he was a bit startled at first by Bakugo suddenly taking his notebook from him, Izuku slowly reached his hand out for his notebook, letting out a nervous, "Huh?" Bakugo flipped the notebook to the other side, allowing himself to take a look at the title of the notebook. "Don't tell me you're taking notes on how to be a hero." One of Bakugo's cronies laughed mockingly. "That's so pathetic." Bakugo's other crony rubbed the back of his head, smiling mockingly just like his friend. "He's delusional." Gareth clenched his hand as he watched how Bakugo and his cronies bullied and laughed at Izuku because of his dreams of becoming a hero. Why they couldn't just leave him alone? Why they couldn't just leave his dream of becoming a hero? Why do they thought of themselves to be better than them only because they were born with something Izuku didn't? It shouldn't matter that Izuku was quirkless. He was a person and deserved to be treated as such. Gareth clenched his hand tighter, feeling a sudden need of going there and helping Izuku. He felt this urge a few times when he was bullied by someone, but always backed away from it in fear of making things worse for himself. This time, however, it wasn't he who was in the need of help, but Izuku. His green-haired friend was one of the few people in his life who didn't treat him like a person of worse category. He had to do something to help him, just this one time. He let out a quiet sigh, making a choice to try to stand up for himself and his friend for once, and started making his way to the scene in front of him. "Yeah, real funny, guys," Izuku said in a nervous manner as he got up from his seat and looked up at Bakugo with a pleading look on his face. "Just give it back." His pleading expression didn't stop Bakugo. His childhood friend moved his notebook towards his other hand with the intention of putting it between his palms. Izuku, knowing what was about to happen with all his hard work on his notebook, moved towards Bakugo with the intention of stopping his childhood friend from burning it with his quirk. He never made it to Bakugo, though, as someone got himself in between him and Bakugo, before he could reach his childhood friend. Even though he couldn't see this person's face as their back was facing him, he immediately knew who it was, because of this person's long black hair. It was Gareth. His friend had stepped forward from where he used to stand a few seconds earlier and moved towards the scene without anyone noticing him until he got himself between him and Bakugo. Give it back to him. Gareth spoke up to Bakugo, trying to sound intimidating for once in his life, but the stuttering made him fail terribly at doing so. He reached his slightly trembling hand out to Bakugo, waiting for him to hand over Izuku's notebook. Now, Bakugo looked at him as he stopped himself from burning Izuku's notebook, slightly taken aback by Gareth trying to stand up for himself and Izuku for the first time since he met him. "What the hell are you doing, mutt?" One of Bakugo's cronies laughed and smirked mockingly at Gareth, realizing what the black-haired boy was doing right now. "I'll be damned. I never thought I would live to see the day. You finally decided to stop hiding behind Deku all the time, mutt? A shame Kazari-kun isn't here to see this. His reaction would be priceless." Bakugo's other crony asked, smirking mockingly at the quirkless boy just like his friend did, but Gareth ignored whatever they just said to him. "Gakken." Izuku moved towards Gareth, in worry for his friend as he knew how much it would anger Bakugo. "You don't have to. I won't repeat myself." Gareth spoke again, this time managing to say what he had to say without stuttering, trying to pretend like he hadn't seen the mocking smirks of Bakugo's cronies. "Give his notebook back to him. Now. Who the hell do you think you are if you think you can order me around, mutt? Are you trying to pick me a fight with me?" Bakugo screamed angrily, clearly displeased by Gareth trying to stand up for himself and Izuku. When Gareth remained silent, he glared at him. His glare looked like it would be able to blowing up the entire school into smithereens. Gareth flinched internally in fear after seeing the glare Bakugo directed his way but remained in his place. "Don't make me repeat myself, mutt. Answer the goddamn question." Knowing that he won't be able to do anything to convince him to hand him over Izuku's notebook, Gareth acted in the heat of the moment. He reached out and roughly ripped Izuku's notebook from Bakugo's grasp. He turned away from Bakugo and looked at Izuku, handing his friend his notebook back. Izuku put the notebook against his chest and looked at his friend in worry, knowing how Bakugo was going to react to it. Even Bakugo's cronies seemed to be too stunned by it, their mocking smirks fading away from their faces. When Gareth turned around to look at Bakugo again, he flinched after seeing the glare his blonde-haired classmate directed his way. Bakugo looked like he was seconds away from blowing up the entire school building into smithereens. Realizing how badly this was going to end, he opened his mouth with the intention of saying something to calm Bakugo down. He didn't get to say anything as his words died in his throat, because Bakugo swung his fist at him, punching him in the stomach. Gareth clutched his stomach, feeling how the air just left his lungs as he stumbled backwards. "Picking a fight with me, mutt? Who the fuck do you think you are, you shitty quirkless extra, if you think you can pick a fight with me?" Bakugo's voice was filled with rage as he yelled out those words as he kicked Gareth in the stomach, making the boy let out a breathless gasp. Gareth continued to clutch his stomach in pain as he let out one deep breath after another in order to regain his breath, fighting to keep himself on his feet. "Did you forgot where you place is, you quirkless shithead? Kakken." Izuku moved towards his childhood friend in worry for his Gareth. "Don't?" He unfortunately never made it to Bakugo and Gareth. Bakugo's cronies, who still looked to be quite surprised by Gareth doing what he just did, grabbed him by his shoulders, stopping from approaching Bakugo and Gareth. Bakugo walked over to Gareth, his angered expression not leaving his face. He reached out and grabbed Gareth by his long hair, roughly making him look up at him, making the other boy let out a painful yelp. His angry eyes looked straight into Gareth's teary and fearful ones as the black-haired boy showed off his now tearful and pained expression on his face to him. This however didn't stop Bakugo. He delivered a firm punch to Gareth's face, knocking the black-haired boy to the floor. Gareth clenched his teeth in pain once his body collided with the floor, trying to stop himself from letting out a painful whine. Unfortunately for Gareth, it wasn't over yet. Bakugo was far than over from being done with him as he intended to teach him a lesson he will not forget for a long time. Gareth let out another gasp a few seconds after landing on the floor. This time however it sounded more painful than the previous ones as Bakugo kicked him in the stomach, which was followed by another one and another one. There was simply no end for Bakugo's kicks. "I should blow you into bits right now if you think you can stand in my way, you goddamn mutt. You can't even defend yourself in a fight you started, you useless crybaby." Bakugo yelled, his glare not leaving his face as kicked Gareth in the stomach for one last time. Seeing that he stopped, his cronies let go off Izuku and walked over to him, now looking down at the quirkless boy on the floor. "What do you have even going on for you in your life? Even that loser Deku has his smarts while you have absolutely nothing. You will always be a pathetic nobody. I'll give you an advice if you and Deku want to become heroes so much. Believe that you'll be born with a quirk in your next life and take a swan dive off the roof of the building. He and his cronies proceeded to look down at Gareth, expecting to hear some sort of response from him, like a pathetic whine or an attempt to deny his claims. He wasn't expecting to see a complete shift in Gareth's emotions. Gareth's face became completely blank, void of any emotion, even the pain from the beating that he had just received from him completely vanished from his face. Even the tears seemed to disappear from his eyes in the blink of an eye. Gareth said nothing in response to Bakugo's words as he proceeded to remain completely silent, not a single word leaving his mouth. He just continued to stare blankly at the ceiling as if he was in some sort of trance and did nothing else. Bakugo scoffed angrily after a moment of waiting for Gareth to respond. It was when he turned away from the quirkless boy and began making his way to the exit from the classroom, his cronies following him. Izuku moved towards Gareth with a concerned look on his face, having the intention of helping his friend, but wasn't able to reach him as Bakugo grabbed him by his collar and dragged him out of the classroom, telling the green-haired boy that he was not done with him, leaving Gareth in the classroom all by himself. The black-haired boy paid no attention to the people who just walked out of the classroom, leaving him all by himself in the place in the process. His eyes proceeded to stare up at the ceiling as he remained unresponsive to everything around him for what felt like an eternity to him. He felt as if something had cracked within him the second he heard Bakugo's words. He felt as if his soul was snapped in the half like a twig. It was when he came to a horrible realization. A horrible realization which had been on the back of his mind for a long time, but always tried to push it away and pretend like it didn't exist, with the intention of finding something to prove it otherwise. Bakugo was right. As much as he didn't want to admit it and as much as he wished to deny it, every word that left Bakugo's mouth a few moments ago was true. In the society where people are dependent on their quirks, he was completely useless even if he would try his best, no matter how many times he will try to deny it. He will never be needed by anyone in a society like this. He will never achieve anything in his life, no matter how much he will try. He will always be an unwanted quirkless nobody. His parents will always see him as a worthless failure, no matter what he will do. He will always be a liability to everyone around him. He will always be useless. Perhaps it will be better for everyone, including himself, if he will just die. Letting out a shaky tearful breath, he slowly got up from the floor after laying on it for a few minutes and collected himself, trying to make himself look as if he didn't just receive a beating from his classmates in order to avoid earning attention from the other people. He wiped the tear marks from his cheeks. He pushed the door open and gently closed it before making his way down the hallway. It was pretty empty now, because most of his schoolmates had already went home at this point, but a few people remained in the hallway. The people on the hallway paid no attention to him as they were too busy with their own stuff such as chatting with their friends or searching through their lockers for something. He walked out of the school building shortly after and began walking forward himself, passing by a few more of his schoolmates who were chatting with their friends as he did so. He stopped once he reached a crossroad. He normally would turn to the right, which was the way leading to his home. Today, he had no intention of going back there. He titled his head to the left and was about to turn the corner in this direction, but a familiar voice made him stop dead in his tracks. Gakken. A voice which belonged to Izuku rang through his ears. He turned to the source of it and saw Izuku running towards him, with his notebook in his hands. His friend's look was the one of worry and guilt. Gareth glanced at Izuku's hands and saw his friend holding his beloved notebook. Good. At least he managed to help his friend for once. I finally found you. I'm so sorry. If I knew what would ha. It was nothing, Midoriya-kun. I know how much work you're putting in your notebooks and I didn't want all your hard work to go to waste. Gareth prevented his friend from saying more, trying to brush this off like it was nothing important. You always helped me whenever someone was bullying me or making some mean comments about me. I just returned the favor for once instead of doing nothing as always. You don't owe me anything, Gakken. Izuku said, trying to assure his friend that he owed him nothing and that he did all those things without accepting to get anything in return from him. You shouldn't put yourself in danger because you think you owe me something. I never did it because I accepted something in return from you for it. I was helping you whenever you were in trouble, because we're friends and friends are supposed to help each other. In that case I helped you because you're my friend. Gareth smiled slightly at his friend once he said those words. Izuku will truly be an amazing hero. His smile quickly faded away from his face, though. It was when he took a step away from Izuku, beginning to head in his way. I should get going. Where are you going? Izuku looked confused by Gareth taking a different way than usual. I thought we'll be walking home together. I have to take care of something in the city. My parents wanted me to get something for them. Gareth quickly came up with a lie to why he couldn't come with Izuku today. He rubbed the back of his head as he tried to act sheepish in front of his friend, pretending like it was something he forgot to tell him about this. I must have forgotten to tell you about this earlier. Sorry. I see. Izuku nodded in understanding and offered his friend a goodbye. See you tomorrow. See you tomorrow? Gareth nodded his head in response. Izuku turned away from Gareth and was about to head out in his own direction. Gareth remained his place and bit his lip as he watched how his friend started to walk away from him, feeling like there was one more thing he had to say to Izuku before they will part their ways. Midoriya-kun. He called out for his friend after a second, making him stop in his tracks and turn around to look at him. He needed to say it to him. Have I ever told you how much I appreciate you being my friend for all these years? Izuku looked at Gareth in concern, feeling like there was something off about his words and the tone he said them to him. Is everything all right, Gakken? Gareth's face wore a fake smile, the black-haired boy trying to make it as real as he could. Yes. Everything is fine. Are you sure? Izuku wanted to be sure, this feeling regarding his friend's words not leaving him. You know you can always tell me if something is wrong. Gareth stayed silent after hearing Izuku's words, biting his bottom lip. He thought a few times about telling Izuku how he felt about himself and how much he felt like his existence was useless, but always backed away from this idea whenever it crossed his mind. Izuku was dealing with some stuff on his own, with his own bullying problem being the main example of it, and he didn't want to bother his friend with his own problems. Yes. I'm sure. He responded after a moment, the fake smile not leaving his lips as he turned away from Izuku, his back now facing his friend as he offered him his goodbyes. I'll see you tomorrow, Midoriya-kun. Yeah. Izuku remained skeptical, the concerned look not leaving his face. It was when the two friends parted ways and went on their separate ways, Izuku making his way towards his house and Gareth making his way towards whatever place he will decide to visit today, having no intention of returning to his home. It had been a few hours since Gareth left his school. Gareth spent these few hours in the city, wandering around it, taking an occasional stop at the places where he usually went to forget about his everyday problems, such as the arcades where he made sure to play his favorite arcades or his favorite bakery where they sold his favorite cake. This place was actually one of the reasons why he took interest in baking and started learning how to prepare his very own baked goods. It was night now. The sun had disappeared from the horizon a while ago and the darkness covered the entire area around him. The streets were almost completely dark, only slightly illuminated by the streetlights. Gareth was on the top of the roof of some random building he had stumbled upon when he was wandering the darkened streets all by himself. He didn't know why he chose this building out of all the buildings in the city. The dark-haired boy was sitting on the ground of the roof of the said building, leaning against a small elevation made of bricks. His gaze was set upwards on the stars and the moon above him. The night sky was really beautiful tonight. There wasn't a single cloud on the sky tonight and it allowed him to get a good look at the moon and all the stars. A lot of his stuff was scattered on the ground around him. His backpack, which he hadn't opened since he left the school, was right next to him. He placed it against the elevation he was leaning against right after he found this spot on the roof. His wallet, which was almost empty because he had spent almost all of his money when he was visiting his favorite places in the city, was laying a few meters away from him on his right side. His school ID, which he had taken out of his wallet before throwing it aside, was laying next to it. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone before lifting it up to his face. He hadn't checked it since he left the school. He unlocked it and cringed a bit when the screen shined into his eyes because they were already used to the darkness around him. He put his free hand before his eyes, waiting for him to get used to the light again. Once they did, he set his eyes back on it, immediately spotting the two messages from his parents. Where are you? Did you not understand anything from our lecture yesterday? You better be ready for when you come home. Have you not learned anything yesterday? Accept consequences once you will return home. Gareth had a completely blank, emotionless look on his face once he read those messages. He let out a sigh as soon as he read them, not knowing what was he accepting to see the messages from his parents. His parents never worried about him before, no matter how bruised and tearful he was going back home after another unpleasant encounter his bullies, so why they should worry about him now? Normally he would start feeling nervous inside after reading his parents' messages in fear of receiving another long harsh lecture from them about him making them look like a bad parent in front of other people and about how he was not meeting their exceptions, making him completely useless for them, but this time, he just didn't care about it. He had no intention of going back to his home, to them. He clicked his phone a few seconds after reading the text messages that his parents sent him, making the screen turn back. Not having the need to use it anymore, he threw it to his right side, hearing how it slided about 2 or 3 meters away from him, landing probably somewhere between his wallet and his school ID. He shifted his gaze from the stars to the edge of the roof in front of him. He got up from the floor and slowly made his way to the edge of the roof. He glanced down at the sidewalk below him as soon as he stopped on the edge, being only one more step away from falling down to his death. This is how he spent the next few minutes. He just stood on the edge of the roof and continued to look down at the sidewalk, making it the only thing he was doing for those past few minutes. He was unaware someone was standing behind him. The unknown person quietly made their way into the roof without him noticing them and stopped a few meters behind him. The unknown person watched him approach the edge of the roof before picking it up his student ID from the ground. They eyed it as soon they picked it up, paying attention mostly to the part where his name was written. "I'm sorry Midoriya-kun." He said something that he knew would be his last words after a few minutes of not doing anything but staring at the sidewalk below him. "I just can't take this anymore. I just can't. I will always be a quirkless nobody. I will always be useless. No matter what I will do, people will always see me as nothing but a liability." He clutched his right hand into a fist as soon as those words left his mouth, feeling his chest hurt as he fought an urge of bursting into tears. He was not going to cry. This is what he surprised himself upon entering this roof. He was not going to cry like he did whenever people around him reminded him how useless his existence was. He doubted many people would miss him. His parents would definitely pretend to be saddened by his death in front of other people, but privately they would probably be relieved that they don't have to provide for someone as useless as him. The people from his school wouldn't miss him either. His bullies would probably be saddened not by his death, but about them losing a person to mess with, but ultimately they would just continue their lives like he had never existed, and his other schoolmates and teachers would ignore this, just like they ignored all the times when he and Izuku were bullied by someone. The only people who would miss him that he could think of right now were Izuku and Izuku's mom Inko. She was always nice to him whenever he visited Izuku to hang out with him. It was when his mind flew to Izuku and his dream of becoming a hero, despise being quirkless. He wished him to achieve his dream of becoming a hero. Maybe if Izuku will end up becoming a quirkless hero, then people who were born with a quirk will stop to look down on the people who were born without one, which would prevent them from having to go through the same thing as he did for his entire life. He closed his eyes and exhaled deeply, feeling how his heart was pumping loudly in his chest. He held his breath and was about to take one final step of his life, stopped in his tracks in the last second. There was one reason to why he backed out of this in the last second. This reason was a male unknown voice ringing through his ears. "You must be terribly sad." An unknown male voice ringing through his ears made him stop dead in his tracks. Gareth's eyes slightly widened upon hearing this completely unknown voice to him as he was surprised by it. He looked over his shoulder and spotted a man in a suit standing behind him. Gareth noticed one more thing about this stranger. It was his weird black helmet that covered his entire face. "It must have been hard for you, right, Takemura Gareth?" He turned his gaze away from the stranger right after he spoke his name, already guessing his intentions. He glanced ahead of himself, looking at the building on the other side of the street. He wondered how the stranger knew his name, because he had never encountered him before, but quickly got the answer to it because he remembered how he dropped his school ID on the floor of this roof after pulling it out of his wallet. "Why are you here?" he asked him after a moment of staying silent. "Are you here to make fun of me and to tell me how useless I am?" "I'm just here to comfort you." The stranger voiced his intention to Gareth, who remained skeptical and had his back facing the stranger, not turning to look at him again. "I can see how this world has pushed you to the absolute bottom, to the point of you willing to take your own life. All because you were less fortunate than the other people your age and was born without a quirk of your own. I must say, it is quite tragic." Gareth clenched his hands, feeling how tears began spilling down from his eyes to his cheeks. He remembered the promise he had made himself upon entering this roof, did not fulfill it. The memories of everything he had to endure because of him being born without a quirk of his own flied through head, starting with the bullying and the name-calling from peers who always looked down on him like nothing, ending with the neglect from his parents who cared more about their own image and what other people thought of them than about their own and only son flew through his head. Is being born without a quirk a sin? A sin that allows the society to treat like a person of a worse category? Like a liability? You are a human too and deserve to be treated as such. The stranger continued as he slowly took one step towards the black-haired boy. Gareth lifted up his hands and pressed them against his face, now sobbing into them, soaking his hands in his tears as his chest hurt, feeling like his heart was seconds away from bursting out of his chest, that kind of distorted society. Don't you think it is detestable? Gareth remained silent as he put his hands away from his face, revealing his tear-stained face. He wiped his tears from his cheeks, only to have them covered by his own tears a second later as there was simply no end for them right now and they continued to fall down from his eyes. One deep breath was leaving his lungs after another as he looked over his shoulder at the man behind him. I do think like that. He admitted after staying unresponsive for a brief moment, his voice becoming less shakier as he spoke. He paused for a second, biting his bottom lip, causing a small trail of blood to spill down from it to his chin. People like me, people who were born without a quirk are looked down by the society and treated like a liability. We are pushed aside for the sake of people who were born with the promising quirks. People are doing nothing to help us whenever we are stomped upon by the people who think are better than us, because they have something we don't. They just ignore whenever something bad happens right before their eyes, because they think heroes will take care of it, but heroes do nothing to help us. Poor child. Hurt by the people around him for all his life. No one ever reached their hand out to you. Am I right? The unknown man took another step towards Gareth, followed by another one as he was getting closer and closer to Gareth. How about you come with me if you're thinking about throwing your life away? You won't feel like liability anymore if you do. Gareth proceeded to look over his shoulder, staring at the approaching man, debating if he should take his offer and go with him or if he should decline it. He exhaled a few seconds later as he made his choice. It's not like he had any better place to go. He nodded his head at the unknown man, telling him that he will go with him without saying any words to him. Very well. You will be fine from now on. The unknown man stopped behind him and placed his hand on his shoulder in a comforting manner, because I'm here for you. This is the story of how Gareth Takemura became a villain known as the Mask. Gareth had no idea how much time had passed since he had left the rooftop with a strange helmet-wearing man he had encountered up there when he was seconds away from throwing his life away. He lost the track of time after the sun disappeared from the horizon and was replaced with the moon, which was now shining brightly on the top of the sky. He couldn't check what hour it was on his phone because he left it behind on the roof, scattered over the floor along with his other belongings. He and the helmet-wearing stranger had been walking through the city ever since they left the roof together. Gareth didn't know where he was taking him or if they even had a destination because he felt like they were just walking forward themselves, taking an occasional turn. A few minutes after leaving the roof together, the stranger asked him if he could share with him the details of how the people around him drew him to the point where he was willing to throw his life away. Gareth told him everything. He didn't know why he told all of this to someone he had just met. Perhaps he just wanted to get it out of his chest, without having to worry about bothering someone who deals with their own problems with problems of his own. The stranger remained silent throughout his entire explanation, listening carefully to everything he had to say to him. After letting everything he had to say out of his chest, Gareth gazed down at the sidewalk and let out a deep sigh. He froze dead in his tracks when he felt how the stranger put his large hand on his shoulder. This action made him look up at the stranger. It was when the stranger spoke to him. He told him what he must have thought will comfort and made him feel better, ending with him reminding him the promise he had made him back on the roof. It was when a dark portal was appeared in a dark alleyway behind the masked man. Gareth tilted his head towards it as soon as he heard it appearing out of thin air, the sudden appearance of it taking him by surprise. He shifted his gaze from the portal to the man standing next to him, wanting to know how he reacted to this portal appearing out of thin air. The masked stranger seemed to not be surprised its appearance. Or so Gareth thought, because he couldn't really tell the emotions of this man because of him having his entire face covered. He got the confirmation of it a few seconds later. The stranger stepped towards the portal and stopped in front of it He looked over his shoulder at Gareth, who remained in his place, unsure of what he should do right now, and told him to follow him through the portal and that he shouldn't be worried about it, because it was here for the two of them. Gareth nodded at him in response and slowly made his way to him and the portal. The masked stranger walked through the portal and Gareth followed him through it, holding his breath as he did so. He let out a quiet exhale as soon as he found himself on the other side of the portal. He looked around himself, wanting to know where he found himself as the portal behind him and the masked stranger closed. He found himself to be transported into a darkened hallway of some unknown building. He glanced to the side when he heard how the masked stranger pushed himself into a walk. Having no other option right now, Gareth started following him throughout the building. As they proceeded to make their way along the hallway, for a brief second Gareth thought he noticed a short elderly man watching him and the helmet-wearing stranger. He decided to not pay attention to this detail for now, as right now he just wanted to know where the helmet-wearing man was taking him. He got the answer he was waiting a brief moment later, because it was when the helmet-wearing stranger stopped in front of the door. He opened it and stepped aside, motioning to him to come in. Gareth complied and walked through the open door, finding himself in a new room. The helmet-wearing man walked into the room as Gareth eyed it, allowing himself to take a good look at it. The room he was brought into was nothing extraordinary. It looked like the kind of a room you'd see in a dorm complex before someone would put their stuff in it. A bed which would only hold one person was in the middle of it, with a neatly folded red duvet laying on top of it. A wardrobe which most likely had nothing in it was standing the corner of the room. In the other corner of the room were two cupboards. Between the two cupboards was an empty desk with a gray office chair in front of it. The last thing he noticed in his new room were two empty shelves hanging on the wall. In the corner of the room he noticed a completely empty wardrobe. "I'm sorry if it seems a bit empty to you. Everything you will need will be delivered to you soon," the helmet-wearing man said while Gareth eyed the room he had brought into. "This will be your room from now on, and from this day forward I will be your master." "Master?" Gareth slowly turned around to look at him. "What are going to you teach me? You don't need to bother yourself with this question right now," the helmet-wearing man answered as he turned away from Gareth, with the intention of walking out of the room. "Everything you will need to know will be explained to you tomorrow. For now just rest. You need to get all the rest you need. This was surely a tough night for you, and I want you to be as rested as you can be for tomorrow." Wait. Gareth stopped the man from walking out of his new room just as he was about to exit his room. The helmet-wearing man looked over his shoulder, instantly noticing the nervous expression that Gareth had on his face. "I'm sorry if it's a problem to ask you about that right now, but what's your name?" "You don't have to be so nervous. It's not a problem to ask me about my name. My name is All for One. Or Sensei, if you prefer." The helmet-wearing man introduced himself as All for One to Gareth. Gareth nodded his head silently at him in res pose, unsure if he should say anything to him in response. The name the helmet-wearing man had given him sounded more like a pseudonym than a real name to him, but he decided to not push it further for now, as he didn't want to say anything that could possibly anger him. Perhaps he will end up finding out his real name sometime in the future. After answering to the question Gareth had for him, All for One turned away from the black-haired boy and walked out of his room, closing the door behind him. Gareth watched how the door was closed from his spot as he was left all alone in the room. He did nothing else for the next several seconds. He remained in his spot and stared at the closed door to his new room. He moved from his spot after a moment. He sat down on the bed and buried his head into his hands, letting out a deep breath into them, allowing himself to process everything. Bakugo's words back in his school really almost drew him to taking his own life by jumping off the roof from what he was stopped by a villain he had afterwards agreed to come with him. The man he had encountered back on the roof being a villain was quite obvious for him. He doubted a pro-hero would ask him if he thought the society as it was right now was detestable. He couldn't help but wonder, though. Why would a villain come and save him from taking his own life? Why would he want to help him in the first place? Wasn't this supposed to be pro-hero's job to save people? His mind was filled with various questions right now. Who was this short elderly man that he saw shortly before All for One brought him into this room? Why did All for One meant by telling him that he won't feel like a liability anymore if he will go with him? What was he planning for tomorrow? Those were one of the many questions which were flying through his head right now. He pushed those questions away after a moment. He decided to follow All for One's advice and not bother himself with those questions for now. He should be focusing on something else right now. He should now focus on getting some sleep, just like the helmet-wearing man had told him to. If he will be able to get some sleep tonight after everything that happened today, which was something he wasn't exactly sure about right now. He took his hands off his face and looked down at his feet. He reached down, took off his shoes and gently put them down next to his new bed. He then lay down on the bed, not bothering to cover himself with a duvet, and stared up at the white ceiling for a few seconds before closing his eyes, hoping to get a tiny bit of sleep to not take up tired tomorrow for whatever All for One had in mind. All for One walked down the hallway after leaving Gareth alone in his new room, making his way towards a room where a certain person he needed to have a talk with and who definitely had some questions regarding the boy he had brought back with him today was waiting for him. He reached his destination a moment later. He grabbed the door handle and opened the door, entering the room. It was when a short elderly man dressed in a doctor's garb appeared in his view. The short elderly man turned around in his chair as soon as he heard the door behind him open. "Welcome back, All for One." All for One walked into the room, closing the door behind him and offered him his own greeting in return. "Hello, doctor. I saw you bring in a boy a few moments ago." The man All for One referred to as the doctor said, "Who is he if I may ask?" A dark smile formed behind All for One's helmet as he answered to this question. "He'll be my newest project if everything goes as I planned." Gareth had no idea how he felt like when he woke up the next morning. He felt a bit tired and sleepy, because he couldn't fall asleep last night for a while because the questions flying through his mind were keeping him awake, but other than that, he couldn't really describe the feelings he had upon opening his eyes. He sat straight up on his new bed and stretched, trying to break himself out of his drowsy state. He rubbed his eyelids, letting out another yawn as he did so and looked at the closed door to his room in front of him, wondering where the man from last night was going to make himself present again. He didn't have to wait long for him to appear. The door to his room was opened several minutes later and All for One walked in, wearing the same suit and helmet as he did last night. "Good morning, Gareth." All for One greeted him. "I hope you slept well last night." "Good morning." Gareth greeted him back and answered, "I had a good sleep last night. This bed is actually quite comfortable." "I'm glad to hear it." All for One said, "I'm certain you have a lot of questions about what happened last night." "Yes." Gareth nodded in confirmation. "Perhaps this will be the moment when he will get answers to his questions. Could I ask you these questions now?" "Not right now." All for One responded, "All of the answers to your questions will be provided to you soon. For now I want you to follow me." Gareth nodded at him. He got himself off his bed as All for One walked out of his room. He put his shoes on his feet and walked out of his room, entering the hallway where All for One was waiting for him. They reached their destination a few moments later. All for One opened a door to another room and walked into it, followed by Gareth. Gareth eyed the room he was brought into right after entering it. This room was quite large and didn't have much to offer. It was more emptier than the room he had slept in last night. It only had one chair standing in the middle of it. He turned around to look at All for One a moment later because it was when he heard All for One speak to him again. He saw All for One walking out of the room. The masked man told him Hat was heading out of the room for a second to get someone and told him to remain in this room. Gareth nodded in understanding as All for One walked out of the room, leaving him alone in it. The black-haired boy sat down on the chair a second later, waiting for All for One to return. He didn't remain alone in the room for long. All for One returned to the room a few moments later. He wasn't alone, though. He was accompanied by a short elderly man who was introduced to him as Dr. Daruma Ujiko. Gareth saw this man before. He saw him the day before when All for One was leading him to his room last night. At least this meant one question of the many questions which were going through his mind last night was answered. "I'm sure you've been wondering why I took you into this room." All for One stated as Gareth nodded in confirmation. "Allow me to begin with a brief explanation of my quirk as I'm sure you questioned yourself about it. My quirk allows me to take quirks from the other people and wield those powers as if they were my own. It also allows the user to redistribute quirks to someone else." Gareth nodded his head to show All for One that he was understanding the explanation he was giving him. At the same time he was left in awe by how powerful All for One's quirk was. He could only imagine how strong a person would be with the combination of the most powerful quirks. He could only imagine how Izuku, being a known quirk lover and analyst, would react to such a quirk existing. "I'm able of wielding many quirks at the same time because of my power." All for One continued, "You on the other side were not gifted with one. You were treated like a liability by everyone around you only because you were born without a quirk of your own for your whole life. Tell me, Gareth, would you like to change that? Would you like to have a quirk of your own?" Gareth froze in his seat upon hearing those words. His mind rattled, many different thoughts flying through it as he couldn't believe what he had just heard. In fact, for the first few seconds he thought his mind was playing a sick trick on him. This man was really offering him to give him a quirk? He didn't know what to think of it for a second. It was just too sudden for him. He lowered his head, allowing himself to think about All for One's offer and if he should accept it or decline it. Everyone saw him as a liability because he didn't have his own quirk, which often equaled to being a cripple in the eyes of many people, and bullies saw him as an easy target because he didn't have a quirk he could use to defend himself against them. He clenched his hand as proceeded to think about All for One's offer. If he accepted, then maybe he would free himself from his status of a useless quirkless nobody everyone gave him and would forever lift himself from his hopeless life. Yes, he replied after a few moments of thought as he looked up at All for One, making his choice. I would like to have one. Very well. All for One replied, smiling behind his mask after seeing the black-haired boy accept his offer. I'm glad to hear it because I've already chosen a quirk for you. I will have to warn you. The process of receiving the quirk that I choose for you might cause you some pain. Gareth nodded his head in understanding and to show All for One that he was ready for it, bracing himself for whatever was about to happen to him in the next few moments. He let out a quiet exhale as All for One held out his hand out to him, revealing to have a hole in the palm of his hand. I had this quirk in my collection for a while now. All for One began his explanation of the quirk he was about to give Gareth. It previously belonged to a young pro-hero known as the Scarlet Hero. It is a powerful quirk when used in the right hands after you master it to its full potential. The previous owner of it would never reach its full potential, though, because he was an overconfident fool and his cockiness eventually led to his own demise by my own hands, as I couldn't risk a quirk like his to go to waste. Gareth held his breath, awaiting whatever was going to happen when he noticed red veins moving from All for One's hand towards his head. Gareth felt a strange feeling overcoming his whole body when the red veins slowly surrounded him, starting with his head and ending with his feet as he gripped the edges of his seat because of how nervous he became when the veins surrounded him, remembering All for One telling him about this process being quite painful. He loosened his grip around the edges of the seat a moment later, because it was when the red veins completely vanished. All for One took his hand away from his forehead and turned away from him, which led Gareth to believe the process of him getting a quirk from him was done. The helmet-wearing man walked away from him, because he knew what was coming and didn't want to be close to Gareth when it happened. Gareth fell off the chair onto the floor with a loud thud only a second after All for One moved his hand away from his forehead, feeling how the strange feeling he felt when the veins surrounded him turned into a massive wave of pain. He couldn't express the amount of pain he was feeling right now. The pain he felt whenever he was bullied by someone was nothing compared to the pain he was feeling right now. He had never felt such tremendous pain before. He felt like was being burnt alive after being skinned alive. He lifted his shaky hands up and placed them over the sides of his head as he felt like it was seconds away from exploding into pieces. He felt like he was seconds away from losing his consciousness because of the feeling pain he was feeling right now, but something within him was making him stay conscious. All for One observed Gareth from his place, waiting for the black-haired boy to give him a sign he was waiting for as Gareth's hands continued to shake in an uncontrollable manner. He got the sign he was waiting for when Gareth opened his pain-filled eyes and looked ahead of him. The helmet-wearing man noticed a red energy circling around Gareth's eyelids. He knew what it meant. It meant the quirk was starting to accept Gareth. It was all he needed to see. He turned away from Gareth and walked over to Ujiko, stopping next to the shorter man. He didn't consider this entire thing a success, yet. The possibility of this quirk rejecting Gareth still existed if the signs of it slowly starting to accept Gareth were starting to show. All he and Ujiko could do right now was wait and see what happens. Now we wait. He said as Ujiko nodded, he will be no use to us if this quirk will reject him. If this will end up happening, you may use his body for your experiments. Izuku walked to school by himself today. He waited for Gareth to come to meet up with him in the usual spot where they would meet up every morning, but his friend never came. He tried calling him a few times with the intention of asking him if he was staying at home today or if he was on his way to their meeting spot or if he was already in school at the moment, but his friend never answered his calls. The green-haired boy was a bit confused by Gareth not answering to any his calls because it was pretty unusual for him to not answer his calls. Gareth always made to call him back shortly after missing a call from him. The feeling of confusion quickly faded away, though as Izuku came up with a rational answer to why his friend was not answering to his calls. Gareth must have forgotten to charge his phone last night. It happens to everyone from time to time, right? He was forced to push the thoughts regarding his friend not answering any of his calls away upon arriving at his school. It was when he saw a few police cars parked in front of his school, with police officers and detectives split up all around the courtyard. He felt himself becoming confused and surprised by this sight. He wasn't the only one. A lot of his schoolmates who arrived at the school at the same time as he did seemed to be confused and surprised by this sight too. Midoriya-kun. A voice he was familiar with calling out for him brought him out from his thoughts. He quickly recognized this voice. It was the principal. Izuku turned his head in the direction of the voice and saw the principal standing with one of the detectives. He slowly walked over to them, wanting to know why they wanted to talk with him. What is it? You're friends with Takemura-kun? The principal asked him in an almost hopeful tone, looking to be quite desperate to hear a positive answer from him. Am I right? Yes. Izuku replied, nodding his head in confirmation as he grew worried about her friend as soon as he heard this question, instantly realizing that the police was here because of him. What happened? Is he in trouble? The principal looked at the boy with a pitiful look on his face, knowing that he had to break the news to his student. Takemura-kun hasn't returned home last night. He revealed the reason why the police was asking about Gareth as Izuku's eyes widened at his information. His parents called the police last night and they've been looking for him ever since. What? Izuku stammered out in shock and worry evident in his voice as the principal sighed after seeing his reaction to finding out about his friend behind missing. Gakken is missing? Yes. I'm sorry you had to find out like this. The principal said with genuine pity in his voice and gestured to the man standing next to him. The man I am talking with right now is Tsukachi Naomasa. He's one of the detectives who are looking for Takemura-kun. It was the last thing he said to Izuku, allowing the detective next to him talk with the green-haired boy as Nao-sama looked down at Izuku. Could I ask you a few questions about Takemura? Perhaps it will help us find your friend. Of course. Izuku immediately agreed to answer to this man's questions. I will tell you as much as I know if it will help you find Gakken. Naomasa nodded his head at Izuku and turned away from. He looked at the detective standing a few meters away from them and called out for him, Nishijima. The detective in question turned around to look at Naomasa. Could you take this boy and bring him to Asano? I'll ask him a few questions about Takemura in a few moments. Of course. Nishijima nodded as he made his way to them. He put his hand on Izuku's shoulder and motioned him to follow him. Izuku looked over his shoulder at the man and nodded. He followed Nishijima as Nishijima started leading him towards a detective who was leaning against a car. He assumed this man to be Asano. Asano was too occupied with the book he was reading right now to notice them approaching him. His book was red and had a black spot that looked like an eye mask on its cover. Asano-kun. Asano looked away from the book he was reading right now and closed it, covering the cover with his right hand. He looked at Nishijima with a questioning look on his face. Nishijima-kun? Could you watch over this boy for a moment? Nishijima asked. Tsukachi will approach him and ask him a few questions about Takemura in a few moments. Of course. Asano replied with a nod of his head, putting the book he was reading a few seconds ago on the front seat of the car he was leaning against. Nishijima nodded his head at him and turned away, beginning to walk away from them as Asano at Izuku with a bitter smile on his face. You must be Midoriya Izuku. I heard this name many times whenever me or my colleagues questioned your classmates about your missing classmate. Do you have any information on Gakken? Izuku asked him, wanting to know if the police already had any information that could help them find Gareth or if they didn't have anything to work with, yet. Asano sighed after seeing the worry in Izuku's eyes, wishing he could provide him a better answer. I wish I could say something to make you feel less worried. Unfortunately we couldn't find anything which would lead us to his possible whereabouts, yet. I see. Izuku replied as he didn't know what else in response to Asano's words, the lack of information the police had on Gareth making him feel more worried. I must say it is quite relieving to find someone who might help us find him. Asano stated, we asked a few of your classmates about Takemura before you arrived at the school, but unfortunately none of them could provide us answers which would help us in finding him. None of them knew how to answer to our questions and all of them told us we should talk to you, because you two apparently are friends. It's a shame that none of them really knew their own classmate. Even his own parents didn't know anything that could help us find him. Izuku lowered his head with a saddened look on his face, his eyes set on the ground as he waited for Nao-sama to approach him. He felt himself becoming more worried as the thoughts of what could have happened to his friend after they parted ways yesterday plagued his mind. It wasn't the only thing he was feeling right now. He felt how regret started to overcome his whole body as well. He regretted not pushing further the day earlier when he and Gareth parted ways, even though he noticed there was something off about his friend before they went their own separate ways. Perhaps if he pushed further, then maybe Gareth wouldn't missing and the police wouldn't be searching for him right now. If only he knew that yesterday was the last time when he saw his best friend in the situation where they would not be fighting on the opposite sides. If only he knew that this would be the day when his life would change forever. This would be the day when he would encounter All Might and begin his journey of becoming the greatest hero. All for One and Ujiko were together in a dark room with many monitors in front of them. A few days had passed since All for One returned to his shelter with Gareth by his side and gave him his very own quirk the next day. All for One was not wearing his mask, leaving his scarred face on a display for him and Ujiko. He had a hospital mask on him and a few hospital tubs were connected to him. He seems to be making a good progress in using his quirk. All for One said, his attention set on one of the many monitors in front of him from his seat. Gareth was shown on one of the monitors in front of him and Ujiko. The black-haired boy was sitting cross-legged on the floor of his room. He was looking at the red plastic block in front of him with utter concentration in his eyes. Red energy was surrounding his hands as he was using it to float the red block in the air, slowly moving it back and forth. "I can't help but wonder about one thing ever since you brought him here," Ujiko said, his eyes set on the black-haired boy on the monitor. "Why did you brought him here? You don't accept from Tamura anymore?" "No. That's not it." All for One replied, "Tamura will need people who will follow him and fight alongside him. This is why I took this boy with me after I came across him standing on the edge of the roof. The seeds of villainy and hatred for the hero society have already been planted in him by his peers and his parents. All we need to do is to push him in the right direction, but if he will prove himself to be no use to us, then we will dispose of him. You seem to believe this project will not turn out to be a failure," Ujiko stated. "The boy shared his life story with me on the night I found him." All for One began his answer. "He must have been waiting for someone he could let everything out of his chest to, as he didn't spare me a single detail, even if I was a complete stranger to him. Everyone around him, including his own parents, led him into believing his existence was useless, and now he is more than willing to prove himself to be useful to someone who reached his hand out to him when no one else would." As soon as those words left his mouth, Gareth shoved his right hand to the right, making the block fly in this direction. The block collided with the wall and bounced off of it, landing on the floor. A month had passed since Gareth received his quirk from All for One and begun to learn how to control it to the best of its abilities. His quirk was called Red Energy. It allowed him to produce red energy around his hands, which he could do to do various things. For example, he could use his quirk to grab things from the distance and throw them at his opponents. He could use his quirk to float above the ground too. He wasn't very good at this part of his quirk, because as of now he could float only a few inches above the ground and he had to use both of his hands to do it, leaving him unable to fight. If he would try to float using only one hand, he would immediately drop on the ground. He didn't let this fact get over his head because he was just starting to learn how to use his quirk, and because his sensei told him he will be capable of doing more things with it the further he will go into his training and the further his quirk will evolve, including floating above the ground with him being able to use both of his hands to fight at the same time while doing so. His quirk had one major downside, though, and he made sure to make a mental note out of it as soon as he found out about it. His quirk made him suffer through enormous headaches that would make him vulnerable in a fight against someone whenever he would overwork himself or would try to do things he is not capable doing at the moment with it. The lesser downside of his quirk was that he would be unable to use it, leaving him completely powerless if he was restrained or bound by someone. He unfortunately got a chance to suffer through several of those headaches during his training. They were really frequent when he had begun training his quirk. They were so frequent when he had begun how to use his quirk to the point where the thoughts of him not being good enough to have his quirk started to form in his mind. Gareth always tried to keep those negative thoughts out of his head because, despite his failings, his sensei showed to have faith in him and supported him, which was something he barely ever received from anyone, something he had never received from his parents. His room now looked very different than it did when he was brought into it for the first time. A few more things were delivered and added to it after he moved into it. The most notable things was a large TV which now hung on the wall in front of his bed with a video game console connected to it. The other thing that was added to his room was the baking equipment. Unfortunately, he was not able to bake a lot of stuff with it because he didn't have enough time to do right now. His hair was now much shorter than it used to be. He cut it shorter in order to make himself look less recognizable whenever he was going out into the city. His missing case received quite a large media coverage, following the first few weeks of his disappearance, and him having a shorter hair would make him at least a bit less recognizable to the people in the public. The stuff he left back on the roof after he was approached by All for One was discovered 2 days after his disappearance, and this finding sparked a lot of theories about what could have happened to him. The first theory the police had come up with was a suicide theory. Gareth wasn't surprised by them coming up with such a theory after discovering his stuff, considering the place he left them in. This theory was quickly scrapped, though, because there weren't any signs of blood in the area of the building they were found at. The second theory, and the theory they had been sticking to, was that he just ran away from home. This theory wasn't really far away from the truth. As of now, he returned to his room after another training session. He lay down on his bed and grabbed a remote, turning his TV on. He browsing through the channels in hopes of finding something interesting to watch, as he didn't felt like doing anything else right now, as he was wanted to rest a bit after the training. After turning the TV on, he was greeted by the view of a TV report in the news where his parents were shown on full display, giving an interview to a reporter who asked them to speak to their son just in case he was watching them right now. "Please, come back to us, Gareth. We're sorry for not noticing the signs. I and your father promise we will work through this together. We will do everything in our power to help you get through whatever you were going through when you left us. Just please come back to us." Gareth felt a wave of emotions go through his body upon seeing his mother actually worrying about him for once made him and telling for him to come back to her with tears in her eyes, with his father standing behind her with a worried look on his face. He had never seen them act like this. It was the first time when he had seen them worried about him instead of being worried about how the other people viewed them and how he was making their family look. It was when Gareth felt a tiny spark of hope appear in his body. Perhaps this entire situation changed his parents for the better. Perhaps his parents will finally start caring for him and supporting him like any normal good parent would. Perhaps they will finally stop seeing him as someone who was born just to showcase how successful their family was, and will see him as their son instead. A part of him in the back of his head knew he should have taken what he had seen in the interview as something totally legit and should just ignore it. This part in the back of his head was telling him that there was a huge possibility of their emotions and expressing concern for him being just an act they were giving for the media to make themselves look like a good loving parents, when the reality was completely opposite. However, the part of the back on his head which was telling him to ignore this interview was overshadowed by his desire of going back to his house and finding out if this entire thing was just an act for the media to make themselves look like a good parents, or if his parents truly changed for the better. He just really wanted to check this thing out. This is why he went to All for One and Ujiko and asked them if he could be transported to the area of his house for a few minutes to check out a few things. Ujiko opposed this idea, but All for One gave him his permission to go and told him to get ready to be transported to this location. Gareth nodded and left the room to get ready. Ujiko voiced his concern to All for One if this was a good idea, to which All for One explained they should let it happen because there was a huge possibility it could work in their benefit. Gareth found himself to be standing in the area of his household a few minutes later and sneaked his way to his house, doing his best to not be spotted by anyone. He began making his way around his house, making sure to be as quiet and fast as he could because he knew he couldn't remain in this place for long, as he promised All for One and Ujiko that this wouldn't take long. He stopped dead in his tracks upon hearing his parents' voices in the room above him, finding what he had come here for. They seemed to be in the middle of a conversation with each other when he heard them. He leaned against the wall and focused himself on the conversation his parents were having right now, allowing himself to overhear everything they were saying right now. Good thing this entire case is getting overshadowed by the more recent events, his mother said, as Gareth felt how his heart almost stopped upon hearing her words. The utter relief in his mother's voice made the entire thing much worse for Gareth. Was his mother really relieved his disappearance was getting overshadowed by the more recent cases? I know, right? His father's voice followed as he agreed with his wife. The media coverage surrounding his disappearance for the last month was getting too much to handle. What did we even bother having him? He heard his mother take a short pause to let out a sigh, as Gareth could imagine shaking her head when she added, "He always brought us nothing but trouble and disappointment. I'm asking myself the same thing. We would have been better of us if we never had him," his father said, each words that left his mouth being like a stab to the chest for Gareth. At first, he was making us look like a laughingstock in front of our family and colleagues, and now I don't even want to think what they're thinking of us right now after he pulled off this stunt with running away. Gareth clenched his teeth and bit his lip to stop himself from letting out a sound as he clenched his hand in anger upon overhearing his parents' conversation about him, feeling how the red energy started to form around the fingers of both of his hands. Regret of deciding to come here to check if his disappearance really changed his parents for the better or if their behavior in front of the cameras was just an act for the media started overcoming his whole body. Gareth let out a deep breath, feeling how his chest hurt. Of course his parents would be worried more about their precious image of people of success than their own son, even if their son was missing for over a month. He didn't even know why he had this tiny spark of hope in himself that their change for the better was real and not just an act for the media. It was when he felt an urge of destroying a window by throwing a rock at it and using his quirk to float through it into his house where he would confront his parents and tell them how he really felt for the first time in his life. He thought about telling them how all he wanted for them was for say, "We're listening," or "We're here," simply being there for their son when he was in pain instead of giving him long lectures about how useless his life was for them, which was making him feel worse about himself. He wanted to tell them how a man he had encountered last month was more of a parent to him for this 1 month than they were to him for his entire life. The desire of breaking the window and flying through it within him died a few moments later. It was when among all the anger and hurt he felt right now he reminded himself of something. His parents always told him how much of a failure he was for not making a name for himself, just like they accepted him and always told him to even he was coming back home covered in bruises and tears. It was when he swore one thing to himself. He will make a name for himself. He will create a new society where people won't have to go through the same thing he and Izuku had gone through for their whole lives only because they were born quirkless. If the heroes were turning a blind eye to it and were not doing anything about it, then becoming a villain was the price he was willing to pay. He left the area of his family household shortly after because he already had spent too much time on it and he didn't want to be spotted by anyone either from his household or from one houses in the neighborhood. He swore to never return to his house ever again as he didn't want to be anywhere near it. It had been 10 months since Gareth left the roof with a man by the name of All for One who he had come to know as his sensei. Gareth couldn't really say he had any regrets about coming with him ever since. The only regret he had after he went with All for One was leaving Izuku without saying a word to him. Knowing his friend, Izuku was probably worried sick about him. He didn't even want to think how his friend who always adored heroes was going to react to him becoming a villain. There were many times when Gareth thought about paying Izuku a quick visit or leaving him a note telling him that he was doing well, but always backed away from those ideas because he knew how much of a risk contacting Izuku was. He got more skilled with his quirk over the course of those past 10 months. He now just had to use hand when floating above the ground, making himself able to use his other hand in a fight, not leaving him vulnerable during a fight with someone. He was able to float higher above the ground than he used to too. He still had some work ahead of him if he wanted to float above the ground with him being able to use both of his hands to fight, though. The other thing he learned his quirk was able of doing over the course of the last 10 months was freezing people in one place to the point where they wouldn't be able to move even an inch. This ability had one downside, though. It required a lot of focus from him if he wanted to freeze someone in one place. At the beginning, when he started to learn this ability of his quirk, every attempt caused him headaches which he thankfully managed to get past at this point. The other thing which happened to him during those 10 months and was worth mentioning was him receiving his villain costume. He got it a few months ago as a gift from his sensei for improving in terms of using his quirk. He didn't got a chance to wear it to the public, yet as All for One didn't want him going out in it for now. He was still using only his casual clothes whenever he was going out. His costume consisted of a black spiked vest with a gray hoodie underneath it, gray jeans and black studded leather sneakers. The last thing about his costume was the mask which he used to cover his face. He asked his sensei for one when he was informed about him getting his costume soon as he wanted his identity to remain unknown for now, because it would make it easier for him to move around the cities, without having to worry about anyone recognizing him when wearing this costume. The case of his disappearance was shadowed by many other events a long time ago, but the cities were still filled with the missing posters of him. It was a paintball mask which was painted black by whoever created it. It had small spikes coming out from the area from his chin to his nose. He doubted they would be able of hurting anyone if he tried to headbutt someone with his mask on, because he tested how sharp they are by pressing his finger against one of them and wasn't hurt by it in the slightest. The eyelids was what he liked the most about this mask. LED graphics were put over the eye area of it, which allowed him to display his emotions and thoughts on both of his eyes in the form of the two emoticons. For example, if he disagreed with someone, the mask displayed 2 X's on the eyelids, and if he was alarmed by something, the mask displayed 2 exclamation marks. He didn't know how the person who created this mask made it possible for his mask to accurately translate his thoughts into emoticons, but words couldn't describe how amazed he was by it upon receiving his mask. As of now, Gareth was in his training grounds, wearing his outfit as he was in the middle of another training session of his. The remains of many of his training dolls were scattered over the floor. "Good day to you, Gareth." A monitor in his training grounds turned itself on and All for One's voice sounded in it. A smile grew on Gareth's face upon hearing the voice he was very familiar with at this point as he turned around to face the monitor in the corner of his training grounds. "Sensei. Good to hear your voice. Did you come here to watch me train again?" "Not right now. This time I am here for another reason." All for One explained, "For the last few months I observed how you improved in using your quirk and I think the time to test your abilities with it has come." "A test?" Gareth asked. "What kind of test?" "This test will be split up into 2 parts. You'll be transported to Kamino Ward for the first part of your test, because I want to know if you will be able to handle yourself against a pro hero." All for One explained. "A pro hero?" Gareth asked. "Do you really think I'm ready to go against one? What if I am not skilled enough to face one, yet? What will end up happening if this will be the case?" "You shouldn't doubt your skills, Gareth." All for One said after hearing Gareth doubt himself, "You've shown a large improvement ever since I brought you in and I'm sure you will be able to handle the target I choose for you if you will do your best. If something bad will end up happening, you will be transported away from your target back to your training grounds." A slight smile grew on Gareth's face which was hidden by his face as he nodded his head at the monitor in a grateful manner, feeling how the feeling of self-doubt faded away after hearing Sensei's words. "You mentioned something about a target." Gareth pointed out, "Do you want to go against a specific hero?" "Yes." All for One confirmed, "There's one particular hero I want you to take care of. I'll fill you in about him after you'll be transported to Kamino Ward." "All right." Gareth nodded in understanding. He titled his head to the side when he felt the sound he had grown to be quite familiar with at this point and saw a portal which was going to take him to Kamino opening. "There's something I need to tell you, before you'll be transported to Kamino." All for One said as Gareth moved towards the portal, "Don't let yourself to be discouraged if your test will end in failure. You must remember what I am always telling you. Any failure is a valuable lesson you can learn from and improve to make sure you won't repeat the same mistakes." It had been an hour since Gareth was transported to Kamino Ward. During this time, he wandered across the roofs of the building, making sure to stay away from the streets because he knew he would raise the suspicion of the other people if they saw him in his villain costume as he awaited the arrival of his target, making sure to repeat the name and the description of the pro hero his sensei told him to take care of. Noriaki Funaki, otherwise known as a pro hero cyborg. His quirk was called Machine. It allowed him to generate various machinery from his body. He was climbing in the popularity ranking pretty fast and was very effective when it came to catching random thugs on the streets. Not everything about him was sunshine and rainbow, though. He was known to be quite greedy with his sponsors and his greedy behavior only increased as he proceeded to grow in popularity. He found the person he was looking for after a little over an hour. Cyborg was walking along the street, smiling widely as he walked along with a few fans of his with whom he was having a conversation with. It looked like he was not going to walk away from them to do his duties anytime soon. Gareth nodded his head as he started making his way down from the roof, using his quirk to do it. With his target in his view, all he needed to do now was to earn his attention and bring him to a place where he was going to fight him. He knew leading Cyborg to him wasn't going to cause him much difficulty. All he had to do was to cause some problems after he would appear in the area he was waiting for him in. This street happened to have a perfect place to do so. He made his way into a store on this street, ignoring the greeting he had received from the cashier and used his quirk to pick up an ATM machine. The cashier screamed something at him but Gareth paid no attention to it as he made his way out of the store, using his quirk to float the ATM machine above the ground. The cashier's scream seemed to catch the attention of Cyborg as the pro hero shifted his attention from his fan to the store on the other side of the street. Upon noticing a villain who was in the process of stealing an ATM machine, Cyborg rushed towards him, hearing how his fans began cheering for him and wishing him good luck in his upcoming fight against a villain. Knowing he had caught the attention of his target, Gareth dropped the ATM machine on the sidewalk, hearing how it let out a loud thud upon colliding with the ground. He ran into an alleyway next to the store and ran as fast as his legs could carry him. He stopped dead in his tracks after reaching a dead end a moment later and looked around himself, mostly eyeing the dead end he had just reached as he pretended to surprised and panicked because of it. He stopped looking around himself a second later because it was when heard how Cyborg stopped behind him. "Looks like you don't have anywhere else to run," Cyborg said, thinking the villain he was chasing had fallen into a trap. "I don't know if you have a desperate reason for trying to steal this ATM machine or if you were doing it just to earn some quick money, but I assure you, this was the last time when you attempted such a thing." Gareth remained silent, not wanting to say anything to Cyborg as he slowly turned around and faced the pro-hero. "You seem to be pretty young," Cyborg stated in surprise after taking a good look at Gareth's silhouette, recognizing the villain in front of him to be a teenage boy and only a few years younger than him. "A shame a boy your age choose the life of villainy. I do hope you are prepared to face the consequences of your actions today. Listen to me, you might be a teenager, but I can't promise what will happen to you if you won't decide to give up without fighting, which I advise you to do right now." Gareth once again remained silent, refusing to give Cyborg an answer he had hoped for. "I see. Looks like you made your choice." Cyborg sighed, understanding Gareth's silence as a refusal of giving up without a fight. They always have to choose the hard way. Do they? It was when in blink of an eye his arms turned into massive orange gauntlets. He moved towards the villain in front of him and swung his right hand at him with the intention of knocking Gareth down, as he thought should be enough to knock down a villain his age. But unfortunately for him, not everything went according to his plan, as Gareth lifted himself up in the air with his quirk before Cyborg could land a strike on him. Now floating above the ground and his target, Gareth quickly eyed his surroundings in hopes of finding something he could use to strike back, and noticed a dumpster standing next to his target. He left his right hand out towards the dumpster, making sure to keep himself in the air with the left one, and moved it to the right. He shoved his right hand to the side and the dumpster moved itself from the wall towards the pro-hero. Looking out of the corner of his eye, Cyborg quickly noticed a dumpster moving towards him after Gareth used his quirk to move it, and his reaction to seeing it was instant. He jumped out of its way in the last second, the dumpster moving past him and hitting the wall. He looked up at his target and was about to switch to another part of his quirk after seeing how Gareth was not planning to go back to the ground anytime soon, but was stopped from doing so. Gareth formed a ball of energy around his right hand and threw it at Cyborg. It was another thing his quirk was capable of doing. It made him able of forming balls of red energy around his palms, which then he could throw at his opponents. This ability of his quirk had one major downside, though. It was always taking him some time to form a ball, and all he could do with it as of now was knocking down his opponents to the ground. According to his sensei, he should learn to do more with it the further his quirk will evolve. Cyborg clenched his teeth as he held his gauntlets in front of his face to stop the ball of red energy from hitting his body, not wanting to risk getting knocked down by it. This is how the next several seconds of his fight with his masked villain went. Cyborg kept his teeth clenched as he blocked every ball of the red energy thrown at him by his opponent. The impact of each red ball colliding with his gauntlets making him stumble an inch backwards. He moved his gauntlets away from his face a few seconds later, because it was when he realized that his opponent stopped sending those red balls at him, as he didn't have to block one for a moment now. He was prepared to cover his face again just in case if it was a trick to lower his guard, though. He allowed himself to take a good look at his opponent and saw Gareth, who was still floating above the ground but seemed to be a bit lower than a few moments ago. Knowing that it was his chance to strike back, he was waiting for the past few moments. His gauntlets turned back into his normal arms and an orange boogie pack materialized on his back. He was about to use it to fly off into the air but never got a chance to do so because it was when Gareth came flying down at him. His opponent delivered a firm punch to his face with his red energy-covered hand. Cyborg stumbled backwards a bit, taken by surprise by this villain deciding to attack him such a direct way instead of continuing to use his quirk to attack him, and by him deciding to make his way back to the ground, getting rid of the high ground advantage he had over him for a good portion of the fight. Gareth returned to the ground because the thought of making sure to not overwork himself was on the back of his mind, and he knew how badly it would end for him if he got a headache during this fight. He managed to come up with a quick plan how to end his fight with Cyborg before coming back to the ground. He knew it was a risky plan and considered not doing it for a second, but ultimately decided to give it a try, no matter how risky it was. The boogie pack vanished from Cyborg's back as the pro-hero knew he won't have to use it right now because it seemed like his opponent was not planning to go back to the air right now. The orange gauntlets began taking the place as Gareth moved his red energy-covered hands towards himself. Cyborg's eyes widened in alarm. It was when he reminded himself of the dumpster Gareth had used earlier in their fight. Unfortunately this time he didn't had enough time to dodge it and the dumpster hit him in the back. The impact of the dumpster hitting him in the back made him stumble forward, the gauntlets finishing taking place of his arms. He looked ahead of himself and saw Gareth charging towards him with his red energy fist heading in his direction. Gareth hit him in the face again, making him stumble backwards. He pressed his back against the dumpster as Gareth stopped in front of him with the intention of punching him again. Cyborg smirked to himself once he saw Gareth standing right in front of him, knowing that he had his opponent. He instantly took advantage of this situation. He raised his right gauntlet, making sure to be quick to not let his opponent spot him doing this, and punched Gareth with it, not giving him a chance to land another punch at his face. Gareth stumbled backwards after Cyborg hit him, the emoticons on his eyelids displaying pain as Cyborg's smirk grew as he punched him again, the second punch sending him flying towards the bricky wall behind him. Gareth landed against the wall and slowly slided down it. He lowered his head, setting his gaze on the ground, and he landed on his butt a second later, unmoving. "As I said earlier, it's a shame you decided to become a villain," Cyborg said as he walked over to Gareth's unmoving body, convinced he managed to knock him out. "You'd make a good hero with a quirk like." His words died in his throat when Gareth quickly raised both of his hands in the air, revealing himself to be conscious. Gareth pointed his hands at Cyborg, red energy slowly engulfing them again as Cyborg pushed himself into a walk towards him again, with the intention of knocking him out and leaving him unconscious until the arrival of the police, which he was certain was already heading this way. He didn't move even an inch closer to him, through. He looked down at his feet and saw red energy going not only around them but also his entire body. Cyborg clenched his teeth as he attempted to free himself from Gareth's grasp, to no avail. He simply couldn't move anymore. His feet were literally glued to the ground. Cyborg's eyes widened upon realization. He shifted his gaze from his feet back to Gareth. He saw his opponent slowly getting himself back on his feet while still holding his hands out towards him, wiggling his fingers as he did so. His hands were shaking a little as if he was trying to keep himself focused on something. Gareth let out a quiet sigh which fell deaf of Cyborg's ears, relieved to see how his plan worked. He knew allowing himself to get knocked down against a wall was a risky move, but he didn't thought about it anymore because it worked out in the end. He had to admit one thing to himself. Using this part of his quirk on a human being was much harder and required more focus from him than he thought. It was when a sickening snap echoed across the entire alleyway as Cyborg's neck broke. The red energy which was keeping him frozen in one place disappeared from his body because Gareth lowered them, red energy vanishing from his hands. It freed Cyborg's now lifeless body from his grasp. The pro-hero's body fell down like a ton of bricks, landing on the ground with a loud thud. Gareth stared ahead at the body of a young man he had just killed, feeling a bunch of various emotions going through his body right now as he let himself process what he had just done. He had just killed someone. He had just killed another human being. He had never killed anyone before. He knew he would have to commit such a thing sooner or later after deciding to become a villain, but he had still taken someone else's life. He started to feel ill in his stomach a second later after he noticed how the lifeless eyes of Noriaki Funaki stared up at him. He calmed himself down a few seconds later. The feeling of him killing someone for the first time completely vanished. Another feeling overcame it. This time it was more positive one. He did it. He had completed the first part of his test. He was starting to show his sensei that all the time he had invested in him over the course of the last 10 months was not for nothing. He couldn't let it get over his head, though, as he knew he still had to complete the second part of his test, whatever it was, to completely reassure his sensei that he did not waste his time on him and to show him and himself that he was not useless. "Report your current status." All for One's voice sounded in his receiver, breaking him out of his trance. "Have you completed your test, or are you still in the process of completing it? Don't be nervous to tell me if you failed." "I did it, sensei." Gareth's reaction to hearing his sensei's voice was immediate. "I managed to defeat the pro-hero you wanted me to take care of. I'm looking at his body right now." "Very well. I'm glad to hear it." All for One responded. "We will continue our conversation in your training grounds." "Of course." Gareth nodded his head respectfully, understanding why All for One wanted to continue their conversation in his training grounds. It was when he heard the police sirens in the distance, which were getting louder with each passing second. Either the owner of the store he tried to steal the ATM machine from, or one of Cyborg's fans called the police. He looked over his shoulder right, taking his attention off the receiver, as he heard something behind him. He saw a portal from earlier open itself on the bricky wall of a building behind him. It wasn't the only place where it opened itself, though. It opened itself where Cyborg's body was laying, or rather used to lay, because his body fell through the portal and landed on the other side of it. He didn't want to waste any time and stepped through the portal, the last thing he heard before walking through it being someone making their way into the alley wall. He found himself back in his training grounds and the portal instantly closed. He looked around himself. Cyborg's body was nowhere to be seen, which led him to assume the portal it fell through took it someplace else. "You have done well, Gareth." All for One praised him for managing to complete his test as the gate behind Gareth closed itself. "Thank you, Sensei." Gareth smiled behind his mask at the praise he just received from him. "What about the other part of the test you mentioned earlier?" "You don't have to worry yourself with it right now." All for One replied, "The second part of your final test will come soon. You'll know what it will be when the time for it will come." "I see. I'll be waiting for it, then." Gareth nodded in understanding. "Should I back to my training or should I end it for the day because of this test I just went through?" "You should end it for the day. You have passed the first part of your test and deserve to take a break for the rest of the day." All for One responded, "You have proven yourself capable of using your quirk against a pro hero, which means the time to put you in the ranks of the League of Villains and to introduce you to Shigaraki Tamura, my successor, has come. Is there something I should know about this Shigaraki, before I'll be introduced to him?" Gareth asked, nodding his head in understanding, as he wanted to learn more about Shigaraki and the League before he'll be transported to them. He heard about them a few times before from either All for One or Ujiko, but didn't know much about them. Tamura Shigaraki scratched his neck, watching the news on the TV regarding a mysterious villain attack in Kamino Ward which resulted in the death of a young pro-hero known as Cyborg, whose body was yet to be found. Kurojairi wiped a glass clean and dry as he stood behind the counter of the bar, a man made of black mist watching the news report about this villain attack too. He shifted his attention to another older-looking TV which constantly flickered a few moments later because it was when a voice he was familiar voice called out for him. This voice belonged to someone he knew as his sensei. This person was no other than All for One. All for One greeted him and told him there was one person he wanted to introduce to him and told Kurojairi, who was told about this earlier, to bring this person in. It was when a portal was opened in front of Shigaraki and Gareth in his villain costume stepped through it. The first thing Gareth noticed after coming through the portal was a blue-haired young man with a hand attached to his face. The mask-wearing boy looked around himself, spotting to have been transported into a bar. As he proceeded to look around his new surroundings, he saw a smoky figure with yellow eyes standing behind the counter. He assumed this figure to be Kurojairi, the villain who helped him travel between the places with a portal. "Who is this brat?" Shigaraki asked right after setting his eyes on Gareth as Gareth looked back at him. "He is someone I've been training for the past 10 months. All for One begun his explanation of who Gareth was to Shigaraki. "From now on, he is going to your newest ally and will assist you in your plans regarding UA. "Hello." Gareth greeted Shigaraki and Kurojairi. He didn't really knew what he should say to them. It had been a while since he had a proper conversation with someone who wasn't his sensei or Ujiko. He had been going out from time to time after All for One brought him in, but his conversations with the other people were always short. "I have to say it's nice to finally meet you, both of you. I'm sorry if I will come off as awkward right now because it's been a while since I had a proper conversation with someone who wasn't my sensei or the doctor, but I don't like him," Shigaraki commented as he didn't allow Gareth to finish his rather long introduction, growing annoyed by him talking instead of introducing himself right away. He moved towards the black-haired boy and held his hand out to him. Having been told by his sensei what kind of quirk Shigaraki had before coming here, Gareth's reaction to him holding his hand out to him was instant as he stepped away from Shigaraki. The two of them eyed each other as red energy formed around Gareth's hands, the eyelids of his mask, showing how displeased he was by Shigaraki trying to attack him. "Calm down, both of you," Kurojairi said in an attempt to stop them from doing anything to each other, being ready to use his quirk in case if his words didn't work and they started fighting each other. "Master is still with us." Gareth's eyes widened upon hearing Kurojairi's words as he looked at the TV and bowed his head in an apologetic manner. "I'm sorry, sensei. I wasn't planning my first meeting with your successor to go the way it went." "It's all right, Gareth." All for One assured him that no harm was done. "Don't ponder over it so much." Shigaraki turned away from Gareth and walked away from him. "Whatever. So what's your quirk?" "I was born quirkless." Gareth began as Shigaraki stopped in his tracks when he was about to sit down on his seat and looked at Gareth, showing mild interest in him. "Even if I would like to be optimistic, I have to be realistic on this matter. Even if I would try my best, I would still be worthless and a bother to everyone around me in the society as it is right now. Various people hurt me in many ways and no one ever did anything to help me because people who hurt me unlike myself were born promising quirks. In the society as it is right now, people often ignore whenever something bad happens in front of their eyes because they think the heroes will come in and take care of it, but heroes often never show up. Shigaraki remained in his place and silently listened to the boy he was just introduced to. There was one person who reached their hand out to me when I was at my lowest. Gareth continued, this person was Sensei. He helped me when I was at my lowest and ready to throw my life away. He gave me my own quirk. He took care of me. He trained me. He believed in me and supported me even when I failed at something, which is something my own parents never did. I owe him a lot. More than I ever did to anyone else. Shigaraki once again stayed silent, continuing to listen to Gareth. Gareth lifted his hand up to his face and took off his mask, revealing his face to Shigaraki. My name is Takemura Gareth. My villain name is unknown as of now. My quirk is red energy. I will follow you in whatever you're going to do to destroy the hero society as it is right now. And that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, please like, subscribe, share the video and support the original writer. See you in the next video?